Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. This is our last event in a series of partnerships between WXN and Diversity Institute in the 50/30 Challenge. So today we present to you creating inclusive workplaces and bridging generational divides. I'm Virginia Johnson, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications for WXN Women's Executive Network. WXN is a one-of-a-kind community that brings together thousands of bold women, allies, and corporate members in a rich and diverse ecosystem that does professional development, networking, thought leadership, belonging, and celebration. And we propel for professional women to rise and lead. We're so pleased to have all of you from across Canada joining us today. Before I begin, I wish to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples whose presence continues to enrich our communities. And some of our colleagues are joining us online. We recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. And so we do ask, if this is the case, that you take responsibility for your own acknowledgement of your traditional territory. Toronto is the dish with one spoon territory, and the dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Thank you. And now for today's topic. We will be speaking about the challenges and opportunities presented by the generational divide in the workplace. We'll highlight generational issues, the role of technology, challenges to organizations, and strategies for bridging that gap. Joining us today to present this topic are Dr. Wendy Cukier and Nancy Mitchell. Wendy is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Ted Rogers School of Management at the Toronto Metropolitan University. She is the co-author of the bestseller Innovation Nation, Canadian Leadership from Java to Jurassic Park, and a leader in creating accessible digital adoption of disruptive technologies with more than 200 articles on diversity, inclusion, and innovation. She is the founder and academic director of Diversity Institute, which has more than 100 full-time staff, 100 research associates from around the world, and more than 200 industry partners focused on dimensions of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, future skills, and entrepreneurship. Her work on the Diversity Leads project helped shape Bill C-25 and the 50/30 Challenge. And the Diversity Institute is now an ecosystem partner that sign up for the 50/30 Challenge committing to gender parity and increased diversity on boards and senior leadership roles. And Wendy was recently awarded the King Charles III Coronation Medal for her significant contributions to Canada, and has also received the Canada's Meritorious Service Cross, one of the country's highest civilian honors. She holds a PhD in Information Systems from the Schulich School of Business, an MBA in Marketing and Information Systems, an MA, and an honorary doctorates from Laval and Concordia universities. Nancy Mitchell holds a master's degree in political science with a graduate collaborative specialization in women and gender studies at the University of Toronto. She previously worked as a consultant for UN Women, supporting numerous initiatives, including gender equality in the workplace and women entrepreneurs. At the Diversity Institute, Nancy develops strategies for embedding EDIA into processes, and she has worked with cities across Canada, healthcare organizations, federal government agencies, and leads work for the 50/30 Challenge, among others. And with that, I welcome Wendy and Nancy.
Hi, thanks so much. So it's really a pleasure to be back again, and especially to have Nancy Mitchell join me, because I think we can give you two very different generational perspectives on the workplace. So, and Nancy, maybe you can advance the slides if you don't mind, just I'll move through the next bunch fairly quickly. So we're going to talk about a bit about the Diversity Institute. I think most of you have heard about us before. The key thing from my perspective to emphasize is we've been around for a long time. We're based in a business school, so our focus is very much on how equity, diversity, and inclusion support business goals and objectives. And for that reason, some of you may have heard me at a session on backlash, but for that reason, we don't think that in Canada, at least, equity, diversity, and inclusion commitments are going anywhere in a hurry, because as the Canadian population becomes more and more diverse, if you do not have appropriate strategies in place, you're fishing in a small talent pool. You can't meet the needs of diverse markets, and you're missing out on opportunities to innovate. Next, please. Sorry. And so all our work is really grounded in that notion of the business case. And we're hearing more and more from large corporations that, regardless of the political context, they recognize the value of equity, diversity, and inclusion. The only other note I will make, based in part on a session we did just a couple of days ago, is the context in Canada is very strong in terms of reinforcing the importance of these issues. Why? Because we have a charter of rights and freedoms, because we have employment equity legislation that has been around for almost 40 years, because we have a very strong national set of rules and regulations that take precedent over anything else, and because we have a very strong history of jurisprudence. And when it comes to issues of, for example, discrimination based on age, whether and ageism can cut both ways. It can focus on older people or younger people. We have not only national human rights legislation, but most provinces have human rights legislation in place that does not allow discrimination based on age, among other dimensions. So I think it's very important. I know we're hearing a lot of spillover noise from the US. I think it's very important to remember that Canadian culture and history is really very much grounded in some of these commitments, and they're not going away. When we think about multi-generational workforces, I mean, the bottom line is we have an aging workforce. The boomers like me are aging out, retiring or worse, and all workforce growth is going to come through hiring either newcomers or younger people to take some of the roles that we are vacating. At the same time, mandatory retirement is no longer an issue. And so we're seeing in many instances multi-generational workforces where we have boomers like me and people Nancy's age and even younger people, although that hardly seems possible at times, all working together. And we come from very different backgrounds, but we also bring different perspectives and understandings to the nature of the work. And so these multi-generational workforces are both a strength and a challenge, because obviously if your workforce is comprised entirely of digital natives who live online and grew up with the internet, they're going to make assumptions about the design and delivery of products and services that may not meet the needs of people my age. I have to tell you that two-factor authentication is the bane of my existence. I'm too slow to look at the authenticator, get the number, input the number. I can't remember all the different passwords that I have to have, and I would much rather have a person on the end of the phone rather than a chat bot. In fact, you'll find me when I go to customer service, I get a chat bot. I just keep typing in, give me a human, give me a human, give me a human, give me a human. And sometimes I've made the mistake of assuming a human is actually a chat bot. But it's really important to recognize that we all bring strengths, we all bring assets. And while, and I'm a little bit biased towards keeping the boomers around, I guess, but I do think that while young people bring important perspectives and new ways of doing things and innovation and all that we value, it is also true that sometimes experience does actually add to the conversation. And so this notion of having multi-generations working together, while we recognize, and we'll talk more about different expectations, different values, different styles of working, if you can find ways to to build teams and to support interactions across generations, you get far more value than if everyone lives in silos. And sorry, go ahead, Nancy. So when we think about how the talent pool is shifting, as I said, equity, diversity, and inclusion is not really a choice because the workforce is changing. Immigrants make up most of the workforce growth that we've seen and will continue to do so. Indigenous youth are the youngest and fastest growing demographic. We're seeing more than a third of the population right across the country being racialized, and in some communities, what used to be considered a visible minority is now a visible majority. We also know that, as I said, the boomers are retiring, and this is hitting some sectors much more profoundly than others. So things like emergency services, policing, firefighters, who tend to have earlier retirement ages, and to a certain extent, public sector employees are really getting hit hard. And we're also seeing that the population of millennials will soon be greater than the population of the boomers because of immigration. So people like me, and it's, these are all generalizations that are based on overall patterns and attitudes and so on. And you can be a boomer who is as technically adept as most Gen Zs, or who has, commitments to work-life balance that are more associated with the Gen X or millennials. But these are some of the general assumptions that we make, is that boomers, partly because of the context they came into the workforce, are very committed to their work. Their identity is wrapped up with their work. They tend to, I'm still of the generation where you were looking for long-term employment with pension and benefits. Getting a job with the government or a large corporation was really the home run. And people like me, that is kind of horrifying, often stay with one employer. I've had other employers, but I have been at Toronto Metropolitan University now for close more than the years that Nancy has been alive. So that really tells you something. Gen X, who are the next kind of group, tend to be more entrepreneurial. They have more experience with technology, often very resilient and adaptable. And they too have a tendency to stay with single employers. And then we come to the millennials.
Which is my group, and then the Gen Zs. So I would say some of the common positive perceptions about these two younger generations are being technologically savvy. Although I will just say that, to Wendy's point on two-factor authentication, I had to do that just before this meeting, and I hate it too. It's just too fast for me. I can't do it. So these are just some common biases and perceptions, but it's not the case across all generations, but technologically savviness. And I think that helps with change management internally if you're putting in a new technology process, especially with the adoption of AI. It also helps with some of your service and product marketing. If you have younger generations who are maybe technologically savvy, they use the TikTok, they use the Instagram, etc. So it can be helpful internally and externally. We also see there's a perception of millennials being good leaders and managers. And I think this is also in the context of this need for work-life balance, promoting different skills in the workplace, different ways of working in the workplace. So rather than a one-size-fits-all model that perhaps older generations might have been used to, younger generations are now calling for differences in how you support one another. And perhaps millennials are quite good at managing these differences. And then when you're looking at Gen Z in particular, we see a real prioritization of social justice and EDIA in the workplace. And you also see this spill over into their expectations of brands and how brands are actually supporting social justice, speaking out on inequities, et cetera. So you have this younger generation that has really clear expectations of what they're looking for. And going back to what Wendy was saying about how perhaps older generations may stay at a job and have that long-term loyalty, it's not to say that younger generations don't, but it is to say that they're quite clear on some of their priorities. And we do see some evidence that younger generations may be more willing to leave the workplace if they feel that those priorities around EDIA are not met.
And if I may, I should have, sorry, can you go back for a moment, Nancy? Yes, um, just so this is framed, boomers are the people who are born 46 to 65. Gen X's are the 66 to 1980. Millennials are 81 to 96. And the Gen Zs are those born 97 to 2012. So just to give you a sense of how they're broken down, not to tell you my age. And as Nancy mentioned, I think we see differences in expectations, work styles, work ethics, and workplace relationships. Although to her point, I would say that her work ethic exceeds mine. And so it's, you can't overgeneralize. And I think often that is where some of the problems emerge because we make assumptions about different generations based on very anecdotal evidence. I think as well, and I can say this because my daughter is about Nancy's age, part of her orientation to work has been developed in opposition to mine in the sense that she grew up watching me work around the clock and do all sorts of things for my employer that made her feel that she wanted a different life. And so it's very interesting to look at how the different generations kind of bounce off each other. I mentioned before that there are some issues around stereotypes and negative perceptions. And a lot of boomers, as I said, who, may incline towards the workaholic end of the spectrum, in part because of the expectations of workplaces when we started working. We do tend to be less technologically adept. I'm not sure that I would say that I'm less concerned about social justice, but maybe more boomers are concerned about material success in general. And for sure, I have a bias about working for someone who is younger than me. I associate authority and leadership with older people, and I find it really challenging when I see, the prime minister. I'm fine with the president who's 80 years old, but I find it really challenging when I see a prime minister who's young enough to be my child. So I for sure have a certain kind of bias which gives deference to older people rather than younger people. With Gen X's, there's, often they're more technologically proficient than the boomers, but less technologically proficient than the millennials because they may or may not have been digital natives. And the Gen X's also have, because of that, are considered to be more linear and less likely to multitask. Our stereotypes of millennials, and again, you know, this is a stereotype, is that, at least from a boomer perspective, we don't understand why millennials aren't prepared to give their life for their work. We view them as the products of privilege and helicopter parents, and so that they tend to be more self-absorbed and consequently don't necessarily have good teamwork skills and the commitment, the engagement, the kinds of things that boomers might expect from their peers don't seem to be manifest in millennials. And same thing with the Gen X's. We also see them as being less motivated, less engaged, less committed to their jobs, and also having too high expectations and relying too much on technology. So, you know, you see meetings where people have their Zoom on, but are playing on their phone through the entire meeting, that sort of thing. I don't know, Nancy, what's your sense of the stereotypes? Let us have it.
Exactly that. I think that common negative stereotypes among younger generations are that we're lazy and entitled. We expect things immediately. But I think important to remember is the context has changed. Things are more expensive now. Housing is more expensive. Food is more expensive. Daycare is more expensive. Priorities have shifted. We now have a focus on work-life balance, et cetera. So important to remember that this isn't happening in a vacuum. Younger generations do want to enter the workforce. We do work hard. We would like to move up. And it's not always at this rapid pace that perhaps other generations feel like it is, although that's the common negative stereotype. And then, of course, the negative stereotypes around that we rely too much on technology, whereas there might be other ways of doing things that have existed in the workplace or workforce for a long time that we can continue to rely on, that kind of saying of if it's not broken, don't fix it, for example. But I would say, just to wrap up this slide, these are just some negative perceptions or biases. Like we've mentioned, these aren't necessarily true across all the generations. But if you are thinking like this, and if these kind of thoughts are seeping into your mind, they're probably seeping into the processes when it comes to hiring, retention, promotion, who you think is deserving of advancing, et cetera. So that's why we want to kind of highlight some of these positives and negatives, because you might catch yourself thinking, oh yeah, I did have a candidate who is younger, and I thought to myself, oof, maybe they might be lazy and uninspired. I might not give them that promotion. On the flip side, you might have someone who's older and you might think, well, we're kind of a young, tech savvy org. That person might not be a good fit. So just remember these things when you're developing your processes.
Both ways.
Yeah.
And it is, you know, thanks for raising that, because we have seen some very high profile cases of ageism play out before our eyes. And there is, if you're in something like advertising or you're in a tech startup, very often there is an assumption that younger people bring more to the table than older people. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but Nancy, would you also agree that younger people often look at, for example, boomers and think that they're too slow and conventional and hierarchical and uninspiring, and are much more interested in people who are moving at the same pace and have the same values that they do?
Yeah, the biases and perceptions go both ways for sure.
Great. So then when we look at expectations, you know, as we said, a lot of this is stereotypical, but that doesn't mean it's not true. And so this is just some of the data that shows the actual stats on attitudes of Gen Z and millennials, and you can see there aren't the differences that we often assume shape behavior and attitudes. There's not a big difference in sense of purpose. There's not a big difference in values and ethics. There's not a big difference in anxiety or stress tolerance, and so on. And again, just more data that suggests that there are probably more similarities than differences between the generations when it comes to something like the adoption of AI. And we just did a study on this, and I call AI the English major's revenge, because what we're seeing is that where some of us were perhaps excluded by the emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and math, coding, Gen AI is kind of the English major's revenge. And so if you can construct sentences and think logically, you can run circles around people who were trained in traditional coding. So prompt engineering and some of the things emerging around Gen I, in my view, are potentially huge levelers when it comes to the differences in technology skills between older and younger generations. If we think about, and Nancy, the numbering on the slides is not visible, so maybe I can hand it off to you at this point.
Sure, yeah, no problem. Hang on, let me just move my thing over. Okay, great. So I think we won't go too much into the remaining slides just because we can send the deck after, and there's a lot of data here, but we did want to present some thoughts when it comes to expectations in the workforce, AI adoption and usage, et cetera. Like, what are the priorities across generations? And you do see that younger generations, although it's not to say that perhaps this is not important for older generations as well, but some of the data shows that Gen Z in particular is really focused on mental health and well-being, EDIA in the workplace, and work-life balance. So this generation is really considering the impacts of their job on mental health. They're considering benefits packages, mental health provisions, et cetera, when looking for jobs. They're prioritizing meaningful work, but also setting some of those boundaries when it comes to work-life balance. And they're really looking for jobs that align with their personal ethics. So something to keep in mind as well when you are developing, your provisions to support staff too, is that younger generations are entering the workforce, and these are some of the things that they're looking for, and they might ask you during the process, for example.
And would you also agree that there is some evidence that younger generations are far more open to disclosing their mental health challenges and struggles than, for example, people my generation, where the importance of kind of toughing it out and showing that you were strong and resilient was the overarching issue, and people simply did not disclose mental health challenges or challenges generally. It was always, telling a story of your successes.
For sure. I think that the way the workplace has shifted now is there's a real openness. There's more of a we're a family and less of we're a rigid workforce. And so I think people are more willing to share their needs in an open way than perhaps in the past. And that's where the disclosure comes in. I'll just add a little bit more. It does seem that there are some opportunities for mentorship across the generations and collaboration across them. I think, of course, COVID has impacted the workplace and specifically the younger generations and how they communicate, how they want to have their meetings in person, calls versus online chats, et cetera. But you do see that there are some opportunities for boomers and Gen X's to mentor the younger generations, coaching, et cetera. So collaboration across the generations should be emphasized. Wendy, I'll pass it back to you to talk about ageism for older generations, and then I'll take for younger.
Sure. Well, I think we saw the Lisa LaFlamme case play out very visibly for all of us, and I think that really highlighted some of the concerns, especially for aging women. I mean, this is a case where I think we have an intersectional perspective, because often as men get older, they are more revered and more regarded as being authorities and experienced and so on. And as women get older, they lose their cachet. So I think ageism plays out differently for men and for women in the workplace. But for sure, there is ample evidence that, especially in some sectors, older is not necessarily considered wiser or better. And I myself was told at various points in time that if you hadn't hit a certain level by the time you were 55, it was game over. And as I said, that applies perhaps more to women than it does to men.
I would say same thing, but the perspective is the gender perspective shifts a little bit for younger women. I cannot tell you how many times someone has called me young lady in a meeting that I am leading, not at this job, but other places. And I think there's this, whether intentional or not, this invalidation of younger women in the workplace of, you're a little young to be leading this project, or have you experienced this, that kind of thing. And I would just encourage the people on the line to be mindful of the ways that you treat both people in general, but older women and younger women, the ways that you subtly invalidate them that you don't mean to. So whether it is kind of shutting older women out, or assuming they're not technologically savvy, or, they shouldn't be leading X project, similarly doing the same thing for younger women when they're the one leading the presentation, or they're the one bringing forward the proposal.
And I would say this plays out in the media as well. When you look at who is brought in as experts, there's a lot, I work in areas of entrepreneurship and innovation. It's very interesting to me because what you see are older men and younger men and women, but very few older women given space to speak in those areas.
I would say let's keep going and perhaps go to, because I can share all of these slides after, but I know we have a Q&A. And I think we also want to get to some of the way forward with some strategies, if that works. So I'll pass it back to you, Wendy, to go through the way forward. And if you want some stats, we can share.
Sure. And I think that one of the things we have to recognize is there aren't simple solutions to complex problems. And so when we're looking at why there are these conflicts and why there are these challenges, we have to go back to some of our basic values and culture. And I've already alluded to some of those things that, historically, age was associated with wisdom and expertise, particularly if you were a man. And youth was associated with perhaps innovation and entrepreneurship and so on. So those basic cultural values are really deeply embedded. And we see some cultures far more deferential to elders. If you think about, for example, Indigenous culture, there is a real respect for age and wisdom that I don't think we see across the board in Canada. So there's certainly cultural issues. There are issues related to legislation. Mandatory retirement, for instance, was eliminated in the province of Ontario a number of years ago. And that meant that you weren't all washed up at the age of 65, which previously was the case. So there's legislative issues, there are values and culture, and other things that affect ageism. The level of pensions has a big impact on whether people decide to stay in the workforce or leave the workforce. At the organizational level, we have to look at policies and processes, not just human resources, but governance. Who are the leaders? What are the signals that they send out? I worked for a man, Sheldon Levy, who was quite a bit older than me, but he really prided himself in picking leaders and high potential people, regardless of their age. And in fact, he put a lot of quite young people into roles that others looked sideways at him for, because, really, how can a 26-year-old lead a multi-million-dollar unit? But it paid off very well for him. And so you do see some people who are kind of age agnostic and really good at picking talent, and the leadership, what leaders do, how leaders behave, who leaders champion, plays a big role. Your HR practices and policies, of course, are important. And thinking about age when you're looking at product design is really important, because as I said, my customer service expectations are, if I'm not happy, I want a human who can fix it right away. I don't want to look at videos, and I don't want to chat to an AI, and I don't want to have to read a bunch of stuff to figure out how to get my refund. I want to pick up a phone, call someone, and have them tell me what to do. Live chat, maybe, but there are others, particularly younger generations, who would rather not have to interact with people because they're faster than those interactions require. And then, of course, at the individual level, our our attitudes, our skills, our knowledge, our behavior are things that we really have to address right across the generations. So it's not just making sure that we recognize the contributions of older people and we fight ageism, but it's also that we recognize that age is only a number, and sometimes they're younger people who are much more adept at leading in certain contexts. And the diversity assessment tool, lots of you have heard about this, is really just a way of pulling that together. So tone at the top, critically important. I've already mentioned that. Thinking about reciprocal mentoring or reverse mentoring. You know, I've learned a lot, for example, from Nancy about many issues that were simply not part of my worldview. I've learned a lot from younger staff about how to use technology, about ways to communicate, because I'm a product of a pre-internet environment. So there are lots of ways that you can have reverse mentoring, as well as the classic older, wiser mentors the grasshopper. Next. And human resources processes are really important, making sure that you are thinking about age inclusion when you're doing job design, making sure that your selection processes take into account the potential for bias, making sure that you have flexible working arrangements, because those are important to accommodate not just people with disabilities, not just people with children, but also people with elder care responsibilities. And so flexible working environments are really key. And thinking about how you deliver everything, whether it's training, whether it's programs, whether it's products and services, with an age lens is very important. And some examples that perhaps are worth noting are, we see even in the mining industry more focus on issues related to sustainability, in part because mining recognizes it has a bit of a reputational problem if it does not show its commitments around environmental stewardship and responsibility. And so Tech Resources has a very targeted effort, not just to provide outreach to young people, but also to engage women in the workforce. Nancy, do you want to pick this up?
Sure. So I think we've gone through some really tangible ways that you can avoid ageism and embed efforts to promote a multi-generational workforce in some of the processes, like Wendy talked about, the HR processes, the recruitment process, et cetera. Values and culture can feel a little bit vague, so I wanted to offer you some tangible ways that you can shift the culture. But I think too here, so it's kind of how the culture is presented. You can think about a tech startup that presents themselves as a young, energetic workforce. And what kind of vibe is that signaling to older generations who are maybe interested and could offer a lot of value and skill that are kind of being excluded just because of what I'll continue to call the vibe. And you can think of another organization that perhaps has individuals who have been there for a really long time. They have a specific way of doing things, and how are they emoting a different vibe that indicates that perhaps they're not interested in younger individuals who maybe want to change processes. I would say there's some ways in particular that managers have a role in actually creating some kind of inclusive workplace culture for multi-generational workforces. Something that I'm a really big advocate for is if you are a manager on the line, it's your responsibility to make intentional time to connect one-on-one with the people in your organization or on your team. Even if you're having regular one-on-one meetings, you can get a better understanding of the ways that different people like to work. There might be, and this is no matter the age, but there might be some people who would prefer a call. They prefer verbal instructions, like that's helpful for them. There might be people who would prefer to get written instructions. Yep, they got it. They'll come back to you when the task is done. But if you're treating everyone the exact same way, you're not recognizing the different needs and the different strengths that people have. So I think making intentional one-on-one time is really helpful. And on the right-hand side, you can see some questions that we pulled that might be helpful in guiding your one-on-one. So if you're asking people in an informal way, like, what kind of, timing and hours do you like to work? On my team, for example, I have people that work 8 to 4, 9 to 5. I have people with different childcare responsibilities, people who have other family members they need to take care of. So that flexibility that you can afford within the limitations you have to make sure that people are supported. Asking people how they like to be communicated with. This is actually something that I ask during the onboarding process when someone starts on the team. How do you like to engage? Do you want to meet and talk about a deliverable? Do you want me to send it to you? You go off, do it. You'll come back to me. How do you like to receive feedback? What do you think are your strengths, and what do you think are the things that you can improve on? What do you like to do, and what are things you don't like to do? And I know that we can't, as managers, always accommodate everything, but when you have these intentional spaces to check in, you're better placed to support a multi-generational workforce. Wendy,
Oh, no, go ahead. Keep going.
It was just to say that here's some other things you can think about. So strengthening flexibility, which I talked about, offering support and development opportunities. And I think even something tangible is AI adoption. And you might think that, older generations don't have the capacity to do that, but that's not true at all. It goes back to the biases we talked about, but it's about upskilling. It's about ensuring that the people you have the opportunity to develop their skills when you're introducing a new process, rather than mindset shutting off and saying, well, they're probably not going to be able to do it. And then it's also about recognizing, and even going back to the business case, that when you have these diverse perspectives that are able to meaningfully contribute, you're actually better placed to meet the needs of your customers or your consumers or your stakeholders. So you actually want people of all different ages around the table to say, well, hang on a second, maybe older generations are not super into two-factor authentication, even though I'm not either. And you might have younger generations who can say, well, wait a second, if you want your service to meet everyone's needs, let's get a TikTok account. So those differences. I think also, and Wendy, did you want to jump in at all?
No, go ahead.
Wendy mentioned this earlier, but even cross-generational mentoring or connection building is really important. You're giving older generations the opportunity to inspire and instill their knowledge, and you're also giving younger generations the opportunity to show that they're also up to speed. They have ideas. So I think even as a manager, kind of stepping back, and in the past, there's been buddy systems, et cetera, but stepping back and saying, oh, why don't you two connect and share ideas on how to move this task forward, I think is an excellent way to have some sort of empowerment and ownership that puts these people together. They see eye to eye, they see, how they both bring something to the table. So I would really encourage that if you're a manager on the line. We've talked about this, but I think also an important thing is the conflict resolution. And again, I think if you're a manager on the line, that's something that you manage, but it's about, I'll even bring in a tangible example. When you're having a team meeting, making sure that everyone on the team meeting feels that there's space for them to contribute, making sure that everyone feels that their perspectives are being heard, and validating those differences. Oh, that's a great idea. We hadn't thought of how the youth might view our service. Let's bring in that perspective. Oh, we hadn't thought about the fact that all of our communications are digital. Let's try to bring in print media. So when you don't kind of address or validate the different perspectives that people bring in, it's more likely to lead to conflict because people don't feel heard. So I would nip that and start to validate people's perspectives as they bring them in. But Wendy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, the only thing I'll share is it took me most of my life to come to the point where I really understood some of the things Nancy has been talking about, and I think understood intuitively, which is I tended to give people what I wanted. So, you know, the notion that you do unto others as you would have them do unto you was kind of our golden rule. So how do I like to be treated? What do I like? What inspires me? That's what I'm going to do to you, as opposed to doing unto others what they want you to do unto them. And that is a really major mind shift that I think doesn't just apply in the context of dealing with issues of age, but all the other dimensions of diversity. And it has been one of the biggest uh, sort of insights into my relationships with a lot of the younger people who work in my team has come from my daughter, because I talked to my daughter, who's a very high achiever, you know, in a large consulting firm, has done very well for herself. But when I listen to her talk about what she likes and she doesn't like about the workplace, I realized very quickly that she puts far more emphasis on relational factors, how she is relating with her coworkers, how she is relating with her boss. The social context of her work is absolutely fundamental, where I've always been very goal-oriented, task-oriented, give it to me and I'll run with it. And I also observed it in my workplace, where normally, you know, you've got two high achievers, you give one a task, the other a task, and sometimes there'd be a little friendly rivalry that would move them forward. And what I observed when I was the vice president of research and innovation, I'd give one a task, the other a task. They would sit together, they would work on the task together, they'd finish that, and then they'd work on the next task together. And we actually reorganized the seating arrangements to make double desks, because we had so many people who wanted to do like editing work together, which I found, frankly, bizarre given my sort of individualist orientation. But it's also part of the reason why I think COVID has hit younger people so much more intensely than perhaps others, because of the isolation that it engendered. So those are just some of my personal observations.
Okay. We only have a couple slides left, and I'll go through them quickly because I know we want to get to the Q&A. But what I would say is, oftentimes, if you've come to a session with us, you know that we really advocate for measurement and tracking. And something that we often don't talk about is considering age in tracking. But it is something that you can consider if people are voluntarily sharing that information. So you can consider collecting information on age ratios, particularly in leadership, et cetera. If you have a board, maybe that's something that you want to think about too. I sit on a board, and I've seen that, you know, there's different perspectives depending on the ages, et cetera. And so consider tracking something like this in your organization if you're tracking other kind of demographic or self-identification information. We've talked a little bit about service design, delivery, and training, but I think it's important to note that, yeah, when you have diverse people sitting around the decision-making table, you're better placed to develop services or products that meet those needs. And so you'd want to have those perspectives, and you'd want to think about accessibility, accommodations, desires, et cetera, in your services. You'd also want to think about, oh, hang on. I have an example at the bottom, skills for bridge training, thinking about the training that you're offering to your organization. And it goes back to my point earlier on upskilling, think about AI adoption, et cetera, and how you can offer upskilling to the different staff in your organization. And the last thing I'll say when you talk about expanding the pool and outreach is to really consider your partnerships. I feel like oftentimes, and this is just from my perspective as someone in one of the younger generations, we often are making partnerships with established organizations that have been here for decades, et cetera, but we're missing the youth organizations or the grassroots organizations that they're creating, and they're exceptional and they're really getting things done. And in my work in consulting, I actually have the privilege of meeting with so many. There's so many different committees that exist, organizations that are youth-led, youth-created, et cetera, that you could be partnering with that would help you with your service design and delivery. So really consider those when you're making partnerships. Yeah, Wendy.
And I want to complement that with a pitch for thinking about older people and especially older women. But there are lots of initiatives, like we're preoccupied with digital skills. There are a lot of older women, maybe not as old as me, but who have been out of the workforce, raising families for a number of years. Or I talked to an organization recently, for example, that was designed to support widows. Often older women, whether it's for digital skills training, entrepreneurship opportunities, are completely left out of the mix, even though they have decades of experience coordinating, managing, getting stuff done, juggling, et cetera, et cetera. And they're often completely left out. So I think that's the other thing we need to think of. And certainly, although all veterans aren't old, that's another population of people who are older than the norm that have tremendous potential to make major contributions. And so I think we, as Nancy said, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because we often focus on sort of more established organizations for program delivery, because we expect that youth-led organizations are not going to be well developed. I would say the flip side is also true, where we often think a lot about workplace entrepreneurship, skills training programs targeting youth to get them into the workplace, and we leave older people, second career people behind. So I think there are lots of really interesting opportunities.
Amazing. So that brings us to the end, the Q&A. Wendy, were there any final remarks you wanted to give before we get to some questions?
No, they're fantastic questions, and so we should dig in right away.
Hey, thank you for that. Great presentation. Again, we will be sharing the recording. We will be sharing the slides. So here's a few questions. The first one, do newcomers from diverse places around the world still fit these generational stereotypes in regards to work ethics?
Such a good question, and the short answer is absolutely not. And that's why we do have to always have an intersectional lens, because I think as soon as you are a newcomer, you have a whole different context, both where you came from and what you're trying to accomplish. So I would say absolutely not. And I would also just reinforce what I said before about cultural differences in how elders are treated. And we know many cultures where multi-generational families are the norm, and where you would never, I keep trying to tell this to my daughter and to Nancy as well, you would never talk back to your mother. You would never criticize your mother. You would never tell your mother what to do. And that can be very context specific, but it can also be cultural.
How can Indigenous worldviews inform our understanding of meaningful inclusion of diverse perspectives and bridging generational divides? So in the workplace and in society in general. And maybe that actually comes back just exactly to what you just said about respect of different generations.
Yeah, I think the respect for elders in Indigenous communities is exceptional. And, given my age, excellent. But I think the other thing that we get from Indigenous ways of knowing is thinking in terms of 7 generations about everything that we do, thinking about long-term impacts rather than short-term impacts. And often people who are older, who have seen transformation, recognize the importance of history and historical perspectives. And I think that's the other thing that we learn from Indigenous peoples.
Is there research on the disclosure of mental health state across generations, or was this just an assumption?
Good question. We do have the data. I haven't looked at it. I say it based in part on what we know about. So we know that there are very different reported rates of mental health challenges generationally. So if we look at the impact of COVID, if we look at just general state of mental health, we see younger people reporting much higher levels of stress, mental health problems, and so on. And some of that may legitimately be a function of what Nancy described, which is the pressures younger people are facing are acute and unlike anything we've seen before. I think, however, it's also a function of the fact that younger people are far more likely to disclose mental health issues, disability, cognitive differences, et cetera, than people my generation. And I say that in part based on what we see when we look at data, for example, on boards. And most boards, corporate boards, tend to be more my vintage than Nancy's. And the total underreporting of disability at senior levels, to me, signals these very big attitudinal differences. But it's a really good question, and it's data we should pull. So thank you.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Can you comment on how intersectionality of individuals affects the issues that you've mentioned, such as ageism?
Nancy?
Sure. I mean, I think we gave a lot of examples of the experiences of older women versus younger women in the workplace, but I would also say consider some of the, I'll just talk from my experience, consider some of the ways in which racialized or Black women can be invalidated in the workplace. There's some data, if you're interested, on microaggressions for racialized women leaders, but also the ways in which we often have to prove that we have expertise over and over. So when you think about intersectionality and how it's compounding experiences of discrimination on top of one another, if it's a racialized woman who's already having to over and over explain her expertise or demonstrate it, and then compounded with the fact that perhaps we don't always value younger women in the workforce for their expertise, or on the flip side, as Wendy mentioned, older women, as soon as you hit a certain age, you're kind of, carted off. So how does age then impact on top of race, on top of gender? So yeah, I think there's probably a lot of examples. Wendy, did you want to add?
No, I think you've raised them. And, Nancy, I think you and I have lots of examples where we're doing EDI work in organizations, and we very strategically think about not just the messages, but the messengers. And so there are some environments where it's like, Nancy, you go do that one. And there are other environments where she's, Wendy, you have to come. And part of that is because we know that the audiences will listen to us differently based on our intersectional identities. And there's some people who are going to be more receptive to an older white woman, and there are others who are going to be more receptive to a younger racialized woman.
What does the research say about multi-generational workplaces and best practices? Is there actual research, or are we just still in conversation?
I think this is, it's interesting because in prepping for this, like we have a database of about 1,000 best practices that align to the diversity assessment tool. And what's really interesting is we don't see a lot of stuff written about what organizations are doing with respect to age, because very often it's focused, there's lots of stuff on gender. Increasingly, there's stuff on race. Growing commitments around truth and reconciliation and advocacy by organizations like the Canadian Indigenous Business Council. We see more and more about how you embed truth and reconciliation. I think my friends who work in the disability space would say that still remains an area that is often under considered. And I think a lot of EDI strategies and EDI work is silent on the issue of age. And in fact, there are a number of organizations that champion, for example, older women who pop up all the time at sessions we're doing on access to capital for entrepreneurs and say, yeah, you got all this money for the under 35s. Where do I go? And so I think it's an area of discussion that doesn't get enough attention. There's certainly
So thank you, everyone. We have a few more questions, but we'll make sure that we address them when we send out the recording and the slides. Thank you very, very much, Wendy and Nancy, for joining us today and for this partnership between WXN and the Diversity Institute. There's a lot of links there in the chat to take a look at for information, and for the 50/30 challenge, we would love you to take that survey, and as well to visit wxnetwork.com for more information. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.